Okay, so now that we went a little bit over about power training, strength training, we're going to look at the soleus muscle, which is an important muscle group, important muscle when it comes to power training, and it's um, its part in speed training and sprint mechanics. So the soleus muscle is comprised primarily of type 1 muscle fibers. About 80% of it is type 1 muscle fibers, and it's under the gastrocnemius. The gastrocnemius and the soleus muscle work together when it comes to dorsiflexion and helps with supination of the subtalar joint. What's really cool about the foot is the foot goes from eversion to inversion, and it's very interesting in its relationship with one another. So while, for example, the soleus muscle, actually, as you're doing plantar flexion, so remember, plantar flexion is when you're having your toes down and your heels up, and your dorsiflexion is when your heels are down and your toes are up. So when we go to the point when we're at our heels and we transfer that energy from that point of the ground and pushing off with our heels to our toes, plantar flexion, the soleus muscle actually shifts laterally outside. However, its relationship with the posterior tibialis and the subtalar joint actually supinates the foot, so the foot actually invertedly goes inward, has adduction during that plantar flexion. So the soleus muscle actually and the posterior tibialis and the subtalar joint are actually kind of like a springboard with one another. The soleus muscle actually goes outwards, and so because of that outwards weight, it actually shifts inwards during the plantar flexion, and the subtalar joint and the posterior tibialis push inwards. So it's really like all one motion when you're thinking about it. While the soleus muscle goes outwards, that energy goes from outwards in instead of it just being one instant motion. So, like I said, the role of the soleus muscle, it's a deep calf muscle beneath the gastrocnemius. Its primary action is it plantar flexes the foot, ankles. The primary action is it plantar flexes the ankles and points the toes downwards. So how the soleus contributes to supination: when the soleus contracts, it plantar flexes the foot, shifting weight towards the lateral outside. This biases the foot towards inversion, especially when combined with other muscles like the tibialis posterior and then the subtalar joint to help bring inward. So whenever you're thinking about the motion of the foot, don't think of it as just going through one motion during plantar flexion. However, there's an importance when it comes to its relationship with one another, with eversion and inversion. While one part of the foot goes and everts outwards, this can cause the foot to invert, then through that push off. It's not just as simple as just a simple push down, because if we were to have a lack of eversion and inversion control, then let's say we're walking on a unstable surface, then our foot wouldn't be able to balance through that unstable surface. We need this lever board of eversion and inversion so that we can not only walk normally, and we can assess this through a gait walking assessment, but this will also help us keep balance during uneven surfaces. Okay, so another thing that we're gonna look at, and so before we go into that, I was looking at the video. It's tibialis posterior, not posterior tibialis. I know I said that wrong many times. Forgive me. But now we're gonna look at the muscle tendon interaction, the mechanics of the soleus muscle. So what's cool about the soleus muscle specifically is that there's this decoupling, and so and this is a very brief explanation of it, but what I thought of it as is this different length change of the what we have is the fascicles, then we have I think it's the perimysium, and then around it is the endomysium. And so while, for example, this whole muscle tendon, while this whole muscle has to stretch, the fascicles inside the endomysium actually doesn't have to stretch as much as what's needed for plantar flexion and dorsiflexion in order for it to be able to continuously do that action. Because when you're using, for example, walking or you're running, you're continuously using that soleus muscle, and so these fascicles that aren't changing length as much as with its muscles that are connected to the tendons of the endomysium actually saves ATP, saves energy. So I know how I explained that was a bit off, so we're going to go over it again. So decoupling, during running, the Soleous fascicles change length less than the whole MTU, muscle tendon unit, due to tendon stretch recoil. This reduces metabolic costs and allows high tendon energy storage. So since the fascicles within the of the endomysium of the Soleous muscle is not needing doesn't need to be stretched as much as the whole muscle tendon unit, this actually preserves energy. Let's say that if I told you to run 100 miles and then I told someone else to run 50 miles, now this is very hypothetical, if each person had the same amount of endurance, the person running 50 miles is of course going to save more energy because they're running less. Same thing with this decoupling. These fascicle length doesn't have to stretch as much as the whole muscle tendon unit, so it's actually saving energy because it's able to perform this action without having to stretch as much. So the Soleous demonstrates high local oxidative metabolism, but maintains fatigue resistance in the Soleous dominant tasks. It can produce sustained force for many repetitions with the same fatigue profile as fast muscles. Consequences for speed and agility. Short contact times require high RFD, rapid force production, at the ankle. Soleous contribution is through rapid force onset mediated by tendon stiffness and neurodrive rather than raw muscle shortening velocity. Training that alters tendon stiffness or improves neurodrive to the Soleous and gastrocnemius will change sprint, contact mechanics, and running economy. In sprinting, ground contact times are extremely brief, often 80 to 120 milliseconds at top speed. Within this window, the athlete must generate enough force to propel the body forward. This demands high rate of force development, RFD. I always say rapid force production, but high rate of force development, and the ankle joint is a key site for this, especially through plantarflexion, where it has the connection of the Soleous muscle with the tibialis posterior, as well as the subtalar joint. So going back to for the consequence of speed and agility, because of this, because of the ankle being so vital when it comes to the short contact times, especially for sprinters, right? When you're a sprinter, you need those ankles to be ready to plantar flex and go on to that next stride immediately. So the Soleus is a huge contribution when it comes to that rapid force onset, mediated by tendon stiffness. Remember that very try to make it as least elastic as possible while producing the most amount of force, and the neurodrive needed by the Soleus muscle to push off during plantar flexion. That neurodrive, the drive of the use of motor unit size and motor unit recruitments to push off with power and speed. So the Soleus is a slow twitch, fatigue resistant muscle with a long compliant tendon. And so that what I mean is, going back to the beginning, as I said, the Soleus muscle is primarily built of type 1 muscle fibers. It's about 80% built of type 1 muscle fibers. But however, it's vital when it comes to plantar flexion and that release of speed and power when it comes to sprinters and whatnot when pushing off during plantar flexion. So it's not really the Soleus muscle actually that's being put into play, but it's compliant tendon, the tendon stiffness within the Soleus muscle that is able to push off immediately when in contact. Remember, we have that very short time frame of under 120 milliseconds for sprinters to push off via contact, release power, and go into that next stride. And so the Soleus muscle isn't primarily responsible for that, but it's its tendon that's responsible for that force transfer from the ground to plantar flexion, that tendon stiffness that we want to reduce elasticity and increase in power to then go off into that next stride. So tendon stiffness, the Achilles tendon stores elastic energy during the braking phase and releases it during push-off. A stiff tendon recoils faster and transmits force more efficiently. Soleus fascicles remain quasi-isometric, allowing the tendon to stretch and recoil without requiring fast muscle shortening. Neurodrive, and so like I said, the Soleus fascicles change at different lengths with its endomysium. So while the endomysium, the whole MTU muscle tendon unit, stretches, for example, the Soleus fascicles are actually able to stretch less in comparison to the whole muscle tendon, that whole unit of muscle tendon unit. And so this actually helps stores energy and allows it to be able to last longer during primary usage of the soleus muscle, such as sprinting, where we're in plantar flexion, we're constantly using the soleus muscle in its relationship with the subtalar joint and as well as the tibialis posterior. So a neurodrive, high initial discharge rates, rate coding from from motor neurons allow rapid force onset. Soleus activations pre-programmed feed forward to anticipate ground contact and modulate ankle stiffness. So remember, the soleus muscle isn't primarily about specifically when you look at it is when it's primarily built of type 1 muscle fibers. It isn't built for those anaerobic high intensity exercises that you would see from, for example, type 1 muscle fibers from the chest or your quadriceps that you would primarily see as those are type 1 muscle fibers, but instead its relationship with this tendon being pre-programmed for feed forward movement, that movement to push onwards, being programmed to have, I guess in this way, what I would say would relate with a reduced co-contraction to anticipate ground contact and modulate ankle stiffness in order for us to push forward and reduce the amount of needed dorsiflexion to go into the next stride. So the soleus contributes to sprinting by rapid force onset via neuroactivation, efficient force transmission via tendon recoil, and low metabolic cost due to minimal vascular shortening. The soleus muscle is vital when it comes to its relationship with the tendon via tendon stiffness, but it's also important in a sense of the fascicle length change, as well as it being not being that metabolically as well as it not needing as much energy as you would see from a muscle fiber such as or type 2 muscle fibers when it comes to anaerobic behavior such as this. So it's really impressive the soleus muscle is able to transmit so much energy at such a fast rate given the type of muscle fiber it is, because of its relationship with its tendons and how stiff these ankle tendons are in its interaction with plantar flexion. So training implications: improving tendon stiffness, isometric strength training, seated calf holds, heavy slow resistance, plyometrics. These are all great ways of training where it's shown that, for example, isometrics have shown to increase tendon stiffness, but as we know that as we go into the eccentric, very slow eccentric phase with heavier weight, this will help with mechanical transduction and is vital when it comes to not only proliferation but differentiation of osteoblasts, which will help with a reinforcement of your stiffness of your tendons via bones, and plyometrics, which is vital also, as well as transmitting what you go in from the gym into real life scenarios of athletic development. So in enhanced neurodrive, we have sprint drills with emphasis on ankle stiffness, reactive plyometrics to train feed forward activation, and ballistic plantar flexion work. Example, jump calf raises. So why this changes sprint mechanics and running economy? Better stiffness, improved neurodrive, and economical soleus behavior. Increasing through strength training, isometric holding via also heavy slow resistance and plyometrics are all going to work well together, improving tendon stiffness of that ankle joint specifically, which will help translate when it comes to that plantar flexion and release. So what we're going to go over real quickly is simply just 3 models of training styles that all 3 are great. It's really just based on the amount of intensity you give and recovery. There is no specific training style that's better than the other. Some may work better for others compared to other people, but it doesn't mean that there is a correct way. So we're going to go over linear periodization, undulated periodization, and block periodization. Think of linear as more classic. What I would say is I'd give this to anybody that's starting out in the gym and you're gradually shifting from, like, for example, high volume, low intensity hypertrophy training, or high intensity to low volume, high intensity strength power training. And so this really goes from one shift to a gradual shift where you're going to increase muscle size and then go on to increase strength because they have a correlationship with one another. And it's a very, basic process to anybody that's trying to get into gym makes everything a lot more simplified. And so when it comes to newbie gains and results, you're going to see results within linear periodization really well. But it's also very simplified, and like I said, works for anybody. When it comes to training styles, it really is all just based on intensity and recovery that you put into your training. Then there's undulated periodization. And I like to think of this as kind of changing small details and trying to get everything done all at once. So this can be a mix of heavy strength training, for example, Monday, hypertrophy training on Wednesday, Friday can be power. You're really doing a mix of things, trying to change the smallest of details within each point of training to try to increase, I guess, your results, right? You might do heavy strength training and then hypertrophy and power. And so this power has a relationship with strength, as well as strength may have a relationship with hypertrophy when it comes to muscle gain, right? So this is more of something if you're really trying to be more, well, I would say sports specific. You're trying to really increase everything all at once. I think that undulated periodization may not be the best choice if you're really focusing on a specific movement. Let's say you're really trying to increase your bench press. If you do undulated periodization, it may be too much stress, really focusing on doing heavy strength and hypertrophy power in comparison to if you were to do, and what we'll go next is like block periodization, where you're really focusing on one specific movement or one specific thing, then transitioning to another while keeping on to the qualities that you got from the last block. So undulated periodization for me is really fun when it comes to being able to adjust what I like to do with my training, having a mix up of power training and strength training and make it interesting and see how my body reacts to whether I'm training too hard via strength or hypertrophy, how that's affecting one another. But it takes a lot more dedication in terms of details and a lot more thought into manner of how you're training. Then you have block periodization. These are focus blocks, accumulation, transmutation, realization. It emphasizes concentrated overload of one or two qualities. And this is where I was kind of explaining a second ago, where you're really focusing on one thing, then you're going to the other while trying to retain those qualities you got from the other block. And so block periodization may be really good if you're trying to have like a powerlifting meet and you have block periodization so that you're really able to prioritize one lift compared to the other for certain block periods until you get to that point in which you have your powerlifting meet. And so for me, my knowledge of block periodization isn't that great, but when it comes to what I've done in terms of training, I've always gone for more linear and undulated periodization just because of its simplicity for linear and just basically, yeah, simplicity, and then undulated periodization because it's just been fun and something that I've seen great results in if you take attention to detail seriously. Okay, so now that we talked about periodization, one thing that I want to go over back to what I talked about earlier, but I kind of explained it very briefly, was the Phosphagen system. So this is the fastest and most immediate energy system used during the first 10 seconds of maximum effort. Remember, the Phosphagen system is when ADP works with phosphocreatine in order to turn to get in phosphocreatine gives a phosphate group to ADP to become ATP. Stored ATP already present in muscle fibers, phosphocreatine, a high-energy phosphate compound that rapidly regenerates ATP. So the core reaction, creatine kinase catalysis. The key irreversible reaction is phosphocreatine with ADP, as with ATP with creatine. During excretion, phosphocreatine donates phosphate to ADP to become ATP, and during recovery, ATP donates phosphate to creatine to become phosphocreatine. This reaction is anaerobic, the oxygen isn't required, and occurs in the cytosol of the muscle cells. So remember, we're using phosphocreatine within those 0 to 10 seconds of absolute high-intense activity, high-intense bouts. So when it comes to using our phosphocreatine Phosphagen system, this is vital when it comes to being able to perform as much as you can in a certain amount of time frame, but it's an anaerobic system, so while it doesn't require oxygen, it doesn't last as long as an aerobic system would, as aerobic respiration. Physiological implications, peak power output. PCR availability directly determines peak power during explosive efforts. As PCR depletes, ATP resynthesis slows and power output drops. Recovery between repeats, PCR, phosphocreatine resynthesis depends on aerobic metabolism. Athletes with higher mitochondrial or VO2 max recover phosphocreatine faster. So people that are able to go through the Krebs cycle electron transport chain more efficiently via mitochondrial density. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell that produces ATP yield via the Krebs cycle electron transport chain via the mitochondria, are able to go back to this phosphocreatine, this phosphagen system a lot faster, a lot more efficiently. That's why you see somebody that, for example, is doing sprints, who's worked out for a long time, is able to recover a lot faster because they have a better, higher mitochondrial density and a better VO2 max to recover that phosphagen system in comparison to someone that's never worked out at all and their mitochondrial density is lower. This ATP yield of the Krebs cycle electron transport chain isn't nearly as efficient because their mitochondrial density is not nearly as strong, is not nearly as high. The mitochondria is vital when it comes to ATP yield via the cells, and so that's why it's important to work out, because working out has a direct implication towards mitochondrial biogenesis, protein synthesis, and so much more when it comes to your body's ability to do things. So neurodrive and fiber recruitment, high threshold motor units, type 2 fibers rely heavily on phosphocreatine. Rapid rate coding and high RFD, rate of force development, are supported by intact PCR stores. Okay, so now we're going to look at creatine sublimation. Creatine sublimation increases intramuscular PC stores by 10 to 20%, enhances peak power, RFD, and repeated sprint performance, especially effective in type 2 fibers, which rely heavily on PCR. So that's when taking your creatine, taking about 5 milligrams to 10 milligrams per day, is vital because it does increase your PCR stores, your phosphocreatine stores, which is vital in terms of performance for those 0 to 10 second outbursts, right? That's why they say that if you're really trying to be an athlete and perform at your best, take a creatine supplement such as creatine monohydrate, creatine HCl, because it will increase your PCR stores, being vital for those bursts of energy.